In Scott's opinion, Halloween night couldn't come fast enough. He'd been waiting for the spooky night for so long that when it arrived, it felt unreal. "This is the best day of the year," Scott shouted as he led Blue to his room. Blue was dressed as a blue alien. His costume consisted of an old jumpsuit and a hat with two pipe cleaners used as antennas. "What about Christmas?" Blue asked with a laugh. "Well, that's my second favorite holiday." "You really are weird," Blue commented. "So, are you going to tell me what your Halloween costume is?" "Why tell you when I can show you?" "I'll be back in a minute," Scott replied, before disappearing into the bathroom with a large black bag. Scott reappeared a minute later. When Blue saw his friend in the costume, he burst out in laughter. "What's so funny?" Scott demanded. "You! You're a pumpkin!" Blue cried in between hysterical fits of laughter. "Isn't it great?" Scott asked, while walking up to the full-length mirror and looking proudly at himself. "I made it myself." Scott wore a large orange ball with 4 pieces of black fabric sewn on to make the eyes, nose, and mouth. A pair of green stockings and a green stump on top of his head completed the ensemble. It really is something else." He knew his friend loved pumpkins, but this was over the top. "Scott, are you ready to go trick-or-treating?" Nikki asked, barging into his room. When she saw Scott in the pumpkin costume, her cheeks turned bright red. "No," she said breathlessly, as if she'd just witnessed something horrible. "No, no, no! There is no way I'm going to be seen with you like that. You look like a fool." "That's pretty harsh," Blue commented. "It's the truth. My brother is clinically insane." "No, I'm not," Scott said angrily. "You're not allowed to go trick-or-treating without me, and I'm not changing. So, are you going with us or not?" "Please change your costume," Nikki begged. "No!" "Fine," Nikki said in a huff. "I'll go with you. Thank goodness it's dark outside." "Don't worry about people looking at me," Scott snapped. "They'll be blinded by all the glitter on your fairy costume." "I like my costume," Nikki said defensively. "Let's go trick-or-treating," Blue said, before the situation got out of control. Blue hurried down the stairs with Scott and Nikki at his heels. He stopped suddenly when he heard a little boy crying. "What's that noise?" Nikki asked, while looking over her brother's shoulder. "Someone's crying," Blue answered. "Come on, let's see what's going on." Blue, Scott, and Nikki ran into the hallway to see Mrs. West arguing with somebody at the door. Scott crept closer until he saw that his neighbor, Mr. Worthington, and his crying son, Billy, were the ones that his mother was arguing with. "That thing bit my son," Mr. Worthington bellowed. "Don't you dare tell me that I'm lying. Look at his hand. Do those bite marks look fake to you?" "I didn't say you were lying," Mrs. West replied as she looked at Billy's hand to see that it had indeed been bitten. "I said that it must have been the rat that bit him. You better take him to the doctor." "That's as good as saying I'm lying," Mr. Worthington shouted. "Those marks on my son's hand aren't from a rat. The pumpkin bit him and refused to let go until I threw it on the ground." Mrs. West looked at the porch to see the pumpkin sitting where it always had. There was no sign of rough play. "The pumpkin looks fine to me," Mrs. West said slowly. "Is this some sort of joke?" "Joke!" Mr. Worthington repeated angrily. "My son is crying, and you think it's all a joke?" Mrs. West pointed to the pumpkin. "Didn't you say you threw it on the ground?" Mr. Worthington looked at the porch and gasped. "It was on the ground a minute ago." His expression turned from confusion to anger. I think the joke is being played on us. There's no joke, unless it's directed at me, Mrs. West commented suspiciously. I'm not playing a joke. You are. Mrs. West sighed. This isn't like you, Mr. Worthington. The pumpkin is normal, but this trick you're playing on me isn't. Mr. Worthington began yelling at Mrs. West so loud that his words were undecipherable. Nicky and Blue looked at Scott with wide eyes. Scott couldn't stand there any longer. He revealed himself, preparing to defend his mother. Is this the trickster? Mr. Worthington asked in disgust as he saw Scott standing behind Mrs. West. I can see from your silly get-up that you're an avid pumpkin fan. Tell me, Scott, how did you rig your pumpkin to bite my son? I didn't, Scott answered truthfully. Mrs. West looked seriously at Scott. She had tears in her eyes as she asked, You didn't touch that pumpkin, did you? No. I believe you. Mrs. West turned to Mr. Worthington. If my son says the pumpkin wasn't rigged, then it wasn't. I think you should leave now. I'd be happy to get away from your insane family, Mr. Worthington stated, before picking up his son and walking away in a dignified manner. What was that all about? Blue asked curiously. I'm not quite sure, Mrs. West replied unhappily. She tried to suppress the tears that threatened to flow down her face, but was unable to do so. We've never fought with the Worthingtons before. They've been good neighbors to us for over 5 years. So why the sudden change? I don't know, Scott answered truthfully, placing his arm around his mother. Maybe it was all a joke. I don't think it was, Mrs. West said between sobs. I saw Billy's hand, and it was definitely bitten. Well, his hand must have been bitten before he came to our house, Scott said, leading his mother towards the living room where they all sat down. Please don't cry. I'll get the door, Blue said, getting up to hand candy to the trick-or-treaters. When Blue returned, he looked very pale. He mouthed the words, I need to talk to you, to Scott. Scott nodded, indicating that he understood. Go to your room and lie down, he suggested to his mother. Dad should be home from the office at any minute. Mrs. West nodded, while taking the hand Nicky offered her. What do you need to tell me? Scott asked when he and Blue were alone. The trick-or-treaters who were just at the door said something weird about your pumpkin. What did they say? They said it had cool special effects. Scott felt a shiver go up and down his spine. Something is wrong with that pumpkin. Very wrong. Scott, where are you going? Blue called as Scott ran from the room and out the front door. Scott said nothing as he lifted the pumpkin and carried it into the backyard. What are you doing? Blue demanded. I'm burying it. Why? What's wrong with it? I don't know, Scott said shakily as he retrieved a shovel from the shed and began digging in the garden. That's why I'm so concerned. Blue looked at the lifeless pumpkin which lay on the ground. It looks fine to me, he said slowly. Is there a joke being played on me or something? There's no joke, Scott yelled. Scott continued to dig furiously until the hole was 3 feet deep. Then he took the pumpkin and threw it in the hole. Scott piled the dirt on top of the pumpkin and then smoothed the ground. He placed the shovel in a shed and walked silently back to his house with Blue. What just happened? Blue asked, finally breaking the eerie silence. I'm not sure, Scott answered in a calm voice. Whatever was going on, it's over. And whatever it was, it's gone. Let's just forget about this night, okay?